our two speakers for today are Dr. Amynah Pradhan and Dr. Hussein Rashid. Dr. Pradhan is an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago and studies opioids within the context of chronic pain and headache disorders. And Dr. Rashid is a scholar of religion who works on social issues in Muslim communities in the US. Thank you both very much for being with us today. I hand the mic off to you both.
Yali Madad, everybody. I'm so happy that you could join us. So I'm just going to share my screen and we can get started. So first of all, I think it's just really important for us to ask the question, why is it that people use drugs of abuse? And so when I talk about drugs of abuse, I'm talking about alcohol, nicotine, cannabis, marijuana, opioids, and amphetamines and cocaine. And so as we know, these drugs are pretty addictive, but really the big question is why is it that people like to use them? Well, the first thing is that these drugs of abuse are actually really make you feel good. And we'll get into a little bit about the neuroscience behind that, but the bottom line is that these drugs of abuse are highly rewarding, and that's one of the main reasons that people like to use them. The other reason is that they provide a new experience. So, they're known as mind-altering substances for a reason. They put you in a completely different state of mind. And for a lot of people, they're just looking for something new and they want to feel like they're in a different skin. And that's another reason that people can use a lot of different drugs of abuse. A third reason is a sense of social belonging. And I think a lot of times when we think about social belonging and drugs, we immediately go straight to peer pressure and think about, oh, I'm being pressured into taking drugs. But in fact, it's a lot more nuanced than that, right? Because, for example, perhaps you are part of a team at work that wins a big contract and everybody wants to celebrate by opening up a bottle of champagne or going to the bar and having a drink. And you want to feel like you're part of that team. And so that's another reason that people start, taking drugs of abuse, is because they just want to feel like they're part of the group, which they happen to be a part of. Another reason, unfortunately, is a lot of people will take drugs of abuse as a coping mechanism. So, for example, when people are having a lot of negative feelings, are feeling depressed or anxious, because drugs of abuse, first of all, do make you feel better in terms of giving you that sort of euphoric effect to help mitigate some of those negative feelings. That's one reason that people will take it. And another reason is that a lot of drugs of abuse are actually antidepressants and anxiolytics. And so therefore they actually can help to medicate some of those feelings. Now, of course, this type of self-medication is not very healthy because taking drugs can ultimately result in addiction. But it's just to say that sometimes because people are hurting, they'll use drugs as a coping mechanism. And one of the last reasons that people will use drugs of abuse are because they'd like to enhance their performance. And when we think about performance enhancing drugs, we often think about things like doping in sports. But in fact, a lot of people take drugs just because it helps them feel more focused, or it lets them stay up longer, or it lets them work longer hours. So for example, amphetamines or cocaine are really good for that kind of thing, as is nicotine to some extent. So these are some of the main reasons that people will use different drugs of abuse.
Thank you, Amynah. Really appreciate that introduction. I want to begin, obviously, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Yali Madad, everybody. Speaking to you from Lenape land, New York City. I really want to thank you, Amynah, to setting up this conversation, because I think you talk about the ways in which people use drugs to enhance performance. And I think that leads to a question of what type of culture are we in that we feel like we need to constantly up our performance, whether it's work-related or in the gym. And one of the arguments I would make is that we really exist in a culture of consumption now, and there's social expectations around that. We have social expectations of consumption that is always buying things, always getting things. We live with social expectations of distraction. What's on social media, what's on my phone, thinking about what's on Netflix or what's on Hulu, right? So we're always thinking about distraction. And then related to this is a culture of disposability, just getting rid of things, just throwing things away. So there's really not a culture of sustainability, of slowing things down, of durability. And what this leads to, I would argue, this culture of consumption, is that it leads to us always seeking, or we're always being primed to seek happiness. And I put happiness in quotes because we've heard this from the Imam before, where we're not looking for happiness. Happiness is a transitory feeling. It's not that we shouldn't aim to be happy, but we're looking for something deeper, right? So a culture of consumption, a culture of disposability, a culture of distraction keeps us from true happiness. That is, it keeps us from contentment. And what we have to understand is that our religion offers us a different way of conceptualizing the world, a way of conceptualizing the world that does not rely on consumption for contentment, that does not rely on distraction for contentment, that does not rely on disposability for contentment. In many ways, religion argues against these things. It argues for us to slow down, to think, to reflect, to worship, to take the long view of things. And that means that we're no longer in the moment. We're no longer seeking the next experience. And it allows us to connect to each other more deeply and in more profound ways. Because what all this culture does, these social expectations around the culture of around the culture of consumption, is that it keeps us from connecting in deep and meaningful ways as individuals, which means that we don't recognize how we need help and we don't recognize how other people need help. And if we turn off these distractions, if we really begin slowing things down, if we think about deep connections with ourselves, with God, with each other, then we start recognizing the ways we can help each other. We do actively start helping each other, and we start creating these cultures of connection, which I think are so important to helping avoid bad habits, right? That whether we're talking about starting to experiment with certain drugs or bad eating habits or bad physical habits, that these are all ways in which we can start thinking about, what am I doing? How is it ethical? How am I creating a culture of connection to move me away from this culture of consumption?
So thanks very much, Hussein. So I think why don't we get a little bit into the science of why are drugs so addictive? And I really like to talk about this, of course, because I think it's cool and I study it, but I also think it's really important for all of us to understand, because the more education we have about how drugs affect our brain, the better decisions that we can make when it comes to what we decide to do when faced with taking drugs. So here's a cartoon of our brain, and I'd like to explain a little bit about how our brain senses reward, because this is fundamentally how drugs of abuse tap into our system and become so addictive. And I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty details of this, but what I want to tell you is that we have this part of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, which is in the middle part of our brain, and it sends projections over into different parts of the front part of our brain. And essentially, this part of our brain is full of cells that express something called dopamine, which is a neurochemical that our brain makes and that is released when there are certain rewards that we're faced with. Now, it's really important for us as human beings to be able to recognize reward and to get that little reward hit. Because fundamentally, if we didn't feel any kind of reward, we probably never would have survived in the first place. And so, for example, rewards are very important for very natural states of our lives. So when we eat food, when we're hungry, a little bit of dopamine is released in this reward pathway, which then signals to us, yes, that food was good. We should go and find more food in the future. And if we didn't get that little bit of reward, I can tell you right now, our ancestors wouldn't have gotten very far because they just wouldn't have even bothered looking for more food. The other example of natural rewards are things like social interaction. So for example, getting hugs from our children, having a nice relationship with our spouses, just having a friendly relationship with our neighbors, all of those things give us small little rewards in our brain on a regular basis. And those small rewards are what ultimately allow us to build families, to be good neighbors, and to be a part of our community. So really, this reward system is actually really fundamental for us as human beings to interact with each other and in order to actually survive. Now, the thing is that what drugs of abuse do is they tap into this exact same system. So what they do is they also cause an increase of dopamine within that same reward pathway. But the difference is that natural rewards cause a little bit of dopamine release, and it's really time sensitive. So essentially, you'll have this positive interaction, or you'll eat food, or you'll do a little bit of exercise, and you'll get that little bit of dopamine release, and then it's over. The thing with drugs of abuse is that they give you a huge hit of dopamine. It's like your brain is going ding, 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 ding. This is the best thing ever. And it lasts for a much longer period of time than these small, discrete, natural rewards. And because these rewards are so big, and because they're so long lasting relative to natural rewards, these drugs of abuse are essentially hijacking our brain's reward system. And they create a high that is much greater than natural rewards. And the thing is that the more and more that our brain feels these unnatural or highs from these drugs of abuse, the more our brain starts to think, well, that's pretty good. Like, why don't I just do this all of the time? Because really, this is way better than how I feel when I eat some good food or when I get a hug from my kids. But one thing that I kind of want to just make clear to everybody, and I think this is particularly important in our community, is that drug use is not the same as addiction. So use is the casual use of substances of abuse. So for example, somebody who has a glass of wine with dinner, somebody who maybe smokes a little bit of marijuana every once in a while, or has a cigarette every once in a while. This is not someone that you should consider as an addict. This is a casual user because the drug of abuse is not taking over their lives. And the bottom line is that most people fit into this category. So most people are not addicted. Most people are just casual users. Now, what separates a casual user from somebody who has a problem is that when somebody is addicted to drugs, it's a chronic disease which is characterized by drug seeking and use that is compulsive or difficult to control despite harmful consequences. So it must meet all of those criteria. So a prime example would be somebody, for example, who has a problem with alcohol. And so they've spend all of their time at the bar, or they spend all of their time drinking, and they don't spend time with their family. It's cutting into their working life. It cuts into how much money they can earn. In this case, that will be considered a drug addiction problem. And so if we think about this, the cycle of addiction, what casual users and addicts all start with is in this binge intoxication high phase. Because the bottom line is that people take drugs because they want to feel good. And so we all enter in at this cycle, in this high binge intoxication phase. Now, the bottom line is that as we use drugs, as they leave our systems, we end up in this withdrawal state. And in this withdrawal state, people don't really feel very well. So for example, a hangover would be a great way to describe a withdrawal state. We've also heard a lot about the opioid epidemic and seeing people in withdrawal from that. And that's a very clear example of that sort of negative state that people are in when those drugs start clearing out of their system. Now, for a casual user, well, that's no big deal. They've got the high, and then they go into a little bit of withdrawal, and then it's okay. They can control themselves. It's not a big deal. And then maybe the next time they come back in and have a little bit of high and get a little bit of withdrawal. When you really start getting into this cycle is when this third component comes in, which is called the craving stage, or preoccupation or anticipation. And what this is that when you're feeling down because that drug has left your system and you're feeling really bad, then what people start to feel like, oh, but you know what? I feel terrible right now, but I know what's going to make me feel good. What's going to make me feel good is when I get that drug again. And then you slip back into this cycle. Now, when we think about the cycle of addiction, we often think about things like, oh, well, some low income person who's, sitting at the bar, or we think of, the junkie in the alley that's like shooting up heroin. But in fact, this cycle of addiction could easily be your mother. For example, let's say your mom has chronic back pain and the doctor has prescribed her opioids to treat her chronic back pain. Well, she's coming in on this high. Now, she's taking the drug. She's not getting high per se, but it's stopping her pain, and that makes her feel good. But then when the drug wears off, she starts to feel a lot more pain again, and she doesn't feel very good. And in fact, now, like, she's in a low mood, she's feeling a little bit depressed, but she knows that, oh, you know what, like in another 2 hours, I can take my pill again. So another 2 hours is going to be okay. And that's where that craving sets in. And that's where you start to get into this cycle of addiction. And that's not to say that all people who get prescribed opioids are going to enter into this cycle of addiction, but it's just to say that there's lots of different ways that people can get trapped in this cycle, and that we need to sort of take a step back and think carefully about what our judgment, how we judge this, and who we think might be experiencing this type of addiction. Now, what's important is that once you've become addicted to drugs, well, now it's a brain disease, you know, and I really think that this slide is a very powerful example to show that when people are addicted to substances of abuse, their brain has fundamentally altered. So if you look at the top panel, you can see here, whoops, that this here in yellow, this is looking at brain metabolism. So in someone who is a healthy person who doesn't use a lot of substances of abuse or is not addicted to them, there's a lot of brain metabolism that is happening there. In contrast, when you look at someone who has a cocaine use disorder, you can see that there's a lot less yellow, and therefore there's less brain metabolism. And this person has a fundamentally altered brain relative to the healthy control. Now, if you want to look at that in comparison to somebody who has, for example, a heart disease, it's a very similar thing. So for someone who has a healthy heart, you can see again in this heart muscle, there's a lot of healthy metabolism happening. But in someone who's a cardiac patient, their heart's not so great, and there's a lot less metabolism. So it's really just to show that fundamentally, when somebody is addicted to a drug of abuse, they have a chronic illness, just like someone who's a cardiac patient. And that this type of change is not something that can just be wished away or willed away or prayed away. It's something that actually needs work in order to shift this unhealthy brain back into a healthy brain. What I think it's very important to say is that what addiction is not. And so the bottom line is that addiction is not a sign of moral weakness. It's not a bad habit. It's not a thinking problem. It's not something that only people, you know, who are not very smart are going to end up with. And it's most definitely not a sign of weak character. So this brings us to why adolescents are such a vulnerable period for drugs of abuse. So really, adolescence is the prime time that people start using different drugs of abuse. And one of the reasons that this can become a problem relative to first-time use being in adults is because adolescence is really such a critical period for brain development. So here you have a picture at the top of age 12, age 16, and age 20. And the more purple the brain is, the more developed it is, the more yellowish it is, the less developed it is. And you can see that in this 8-year period, there's a huge amount of brain development that's happening. And the key thing is that most of that brain development is happening in the front part of our brain, which is really important for things like rational thought and good judgment. And so the bottom line is that during this adolescence period, it's such a time of transition where some of those things like good judgment and rational thought are not fully developed yet. Yet, at the same time, this is the age that people are starting to get more independence because they're older and are naturally trying to crave an identity for themselves and carve out something different from their parents. And so really, this is a period where people are most willing to risk things. And of course, because that good judgment and that reasoning part of their brain is not fully developed, it means that, you know, adolescents are more willing to take risks that perhaps as an older adult one would not be willing to take. Now, the thing is that because this brain is in such a transition period at this point, it also means that it's very susceptible to different changes. And so what that means is that drug use in adolescence can actually produce long-term consequences in brain function that wouldn't be the case if somebody had tried to use drugs at a later age in their life. And I'll give you a prime example. For example, people who start using alcohol at younger ages, so between the ages of 12 and 14, are far more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety in adulthood versus people who use alcohol for the first time when they're in their early 20s. And it's because that brain is so plastic and so easy to change at this younger age range that things like drugs of abuse can really alter the directionality of things and then ultimately have really long-term consequences. So if we get into a little bit about what is it that are the most common drugs of abuse, you can see here, so if we talk about adolescents specifically, you can see that the 3 most common drugs of abuse are alcohol in blue, tobacco in beige, and marijuana in this reddish color. And what you can see from this particular graph, which is from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, is that on the y-axis, you have the percent past month use. And you can see that by the time a child is in around grade 11 or so, that they, about 20% of children are likely to have used alcohol in the last month. About 14% have used marijuana, and about 7.6% have used tobacco in the last month. So this is not lifetime, this is just in the last month. Now, this might seem a little bit alarming because we think, oh my goodness, 20% of 16-year-olds are drinking at least once a month. But what I want you to do is flip that number a little bit and think about the fact, well, that means that 80% of 16-year-olds are not drinking once a month. And I think that is a really important thing to understand, because ultimately, one of the reasons that a lot of adolescents feel the need to try drugs of abuse is because they have this sense that everybody around them is doing it. But the reality of the situation is that, well, you know what, probably between 50 to 70% of their peers are not doing it, but they just don't know that, or they don't necessarily feel that. And understanding that, in fact, they're in the majority if they don't try drugs of abuse actually helps youth a long way in making good decisions about drugs of abuse, because then they don't feel like they're necessarily the odd man out. One thing that I think it's important to keep an eye out for are things like vaping. So vaping has really gone up a lot over the last 5 to 6 years. So you can see back in 2015, vaping was not very common, whereas by 2018 and in 2021, these numbers have risen substantially. They've almost doubled in the amount of school-aged and college-aged children or adolescents that vape. Now, what exactly is vaping? So basically, they're the evolution of the cigarette. Cigarettes are kind of old school now, and everybody is vaping. This is just to show you the sort of evolution of vaping. And what vaping essentially is that the current versions are these pod mods, which are these devices that you pour e-juice into that has a real high amount of nicotine in it. And then there's a combustion mechanism that essentially will vaporize that juice, creating a vapor that you can then inhale. And what I think it's really important for people to understand is that, unlike a cigarette, these pod mods can actually have a lot more nicotine. So one pod can have the same nicotine that's equivalent to smoking 20 cigarettes. So really, you're getting a really big hit when you're using vaping devices. And one thing I think it's really important for all of us to understand is that, the companies that produce these vaping devices and these e-juices that are full of nicotine are really clearly advertising towards children, right? So I think there's like thousands of different types of flavors of e-juice. And just looking at these different flavors, you can clearly see that these are not being advertised to adults. These are being advertised to children. And that's actually a conversation that, you can open up with adolescents to say, well, this is an example of marketing that is being targeted specifically for youth. Another very common substance of abuse is marijuana. And so when we talk about marijuana, marijuana is a plant that's actually made up of thousands of different chemicals, including these cannabinoid chemicals. The chemical that is what is responsible for the high of marijuana is THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And so you can see when people buy pot of different types, whether they're going to smoke it or whether they're going to eat it, there's always these different ratios of THC to CBD, which is cannabidiol. THC is the part that makes you high. And again, I just want to make clear that, once again, companies are obviously marketing towards children, because a lot of the edibles that are out there are actually shaped like children's candy. Which, I think if anybody has edibles in the house, something to keep in mind that a lot of times, poison control issues have gone up remarkably since edibles have become legalized, because a lot of children end up accidentally ingesting cannabinoids because they didn't know they were pot candy, or maybe they did know that they were pot candy and they decided to try it out. So marijuana is something that really most people try when they're younger. It's really something that, adults are not so keen on trying marijuana for the very first time. It's really something that youth are likely to try. And the more that marijuana becomes legalized in different states, the more frequently it gets tried by young adults. Something that I think is really important to understand with marijuana, that unlike alcohol or nicotine, there are still many states in which recreational marijuana use is still illegal. And so then when it comes to people who do happen to have marijuana around, this can become a big problem if, for example, they leave their drugs or their drug paraphernalia in like a car that might be used by other members of the family, or they leave it in public spaces like in a bathroom or something in which maybe somebody else could come across it. This can have very significant legal consequences that can then become a problem for people in the future. So I think it is really important, at least with marijuana, for everybody to just understand what state you're in and what the rules are regarding marijuana use there.
And here, I think I want to just build on that a little bit. I think the legal component is incredibly important to keep in mind, especially as they can have repercussions down the line, both for the individual and their families in ways people may not be aware of. However, I think it's also worth talking about the ethical component of this, right? Legal thinking is not the same as ethical thinking. Ethical thinking is longer, more profound ways about decision making and determining what is right and wrong. Legal approaches are not always ethical, right? Here in the United States, one simply has to look at enslavement, which was legal, the disenfranchisement of women or treating women as property, which was legal, particularly in marriage. The Muslim ban was legal. Anti-LGBTQ laws, which are obviously also unethical. The criminalization of poverty in this country. All of these things are legal. It does not make them ethical. And so when we say, oh, alcohol is legal or smoking is legal or drugs are legal, yes, these are all true in certain states, I should say. These are legal, as you just pointed out. It's all true, but is it ethical when we start thinking about what our relationship with it is? And again, I think it comes back to the idea of contemporary culture, of consumption culture that seeks a way for happiness rather than contentment. And so again, legality comes into a moment, comes to the questions of what is of this time. Ethics thinks about what is beyond this time, both forward and backwards in time. And so I just want to raise that issue that legal and ethical are not necessarily the same thing.
So I think what's really important to understand is, how do we have these conversations amongst our family about how to use different drugs of abuse, how to talk about drugs of abuse? And I think that this should not be a taboo subject. This shouldn't be something that we're like, oh, I don't want to talk about drugs of abuse because that's going to encourage somebody to start taking drugs of abuse. That's not how it works. The more conversations you have about drugs, the less likely people are to actually use drugs. And the more, I think, open-minded and understanding we have of one another when we have these different conversations. So the first thing that we should do is find opportunities to talk about drugs abuse. This is pretty easy because drugs are everywhere. Basically, if you're in a restaurant and there's a bar and people are drinking, this is a prime opportunity to open up a conversation about alcohol, for example. We often see drug use in books or in movies. This is something, again, another spot that you can sort of pick that up and have this conversation. And of course, many of us have friends who smoke or drink or do other drugs. And that's, again, another place where you can have this conversation as a family as to what do we think about that and how do we proceed and move forward. I think that it's really important to talk about how we deal with drugs of abuse. And sometimes it's important just internally to reflect about how many times we encounter drugs of abuse and how we actually deal with it. For example, some of us think, oh, well, we're adults, parents of young children, we don't have this problem anymore. But in fact, many of us have this problem all of the time, right? If we go out with our colleagues, we go to a barbecue, we go to a picnic, like people are drinking and then they offer you a drink. And there's a point where maybe it's just become automatic now where we say, no, thank you. But we need to think a little bit about how did we end up in that situation? How did we feel the first time we encountered that situation? What are the words that we use that then allow us to say no or not? And having, I think, those conversations with our family actually gives people the words that they sometimes need in the future, especially our children, because our children then can hear that, oh, wait, My parents have dealt with this as well. This is not something new. And the way that they deal with it is this way. Maybe I can use the same language or the same thing in order to deal with it when I'm faced with it. I think what's really important to talk about, and I think a really easy thing to talk about, especially with youth, is about safety issues. So talking about driving while intoxicated or other legal issues. Because of course, you can have blanket rules that say, well, if you're with a friend and they've been drinking and they're going to drive, well, that's it. You just give me a call. I'm going to come pick you up. That we don't even need to, dig into this too much. That's just a good rule. And so that's a really easy place for us to have these types of conversations. And like I said, I think it's really important that we don't think of drugs of abuse as being a taboo conversation. This is something that, while the more educated we are about drugs of abuse, the more informed decisions that we can make.
Amynah, I can't echo what you said enough, right? If we start with the AKDN ethical framework around the ethic of the sound mind, I'll quote a portion of it here, where it says, quote, "Any substance abuse which interferes with the normal functioning of the mind is a greater violation of the ethical code, for it amounts to self-inflicted loss of personal dignity and of the ability to fulfill one's responsibility to oneself, to one's family, and to society." And when you start engaging in and abusing these substances, you're violating these commitments and trusts. That does not make you a bad person. I want to emphasize what we talked about earlier. This does not make you a bad person. This does not indicate that you have weak character. It means that you need help and support. And we have to think about the consequences of all our actions, because you don't get to abuse without use first. So how do you even think about that? And the way you engage in a sophisticated way around this question of alternatives to usage, I think comes from this idea of clarity of thought. We see this clarity of thought being emphasized here in this passage from the AKDN ethical framework. But also, as you say, education helps us make informed decisions. We need to have that information to have the clarity of thought in order to make an informed decision. In the Quran, there's a story that says God offers a gift, and at that point the gift is unnamed, creation, and none of creation accepts that gift except humanity. And God says, "For truly you are foolish." And the idea is that this gift is the gift of reason, to know what is right and what is wrong. And it then becomes incumbent on us, because we can now discern between right and wrong, to make decisions that lead to that which is right. How can you make the decision of what is right or what is wrong if you don't have any information? You cannot make a decision from ignorance. You can only make a decision from being educated, from being informed, and to having those conversations with your loved ones. And we see this in study after study, and I'm sure you can probably cite them more fully. But whether it is about sex education or drug education, the more intelligent and informed our children are, the better decisions they will consistently make. That we see this, that if you have the informed decision, that our youth will always choose better decisions when they are well informed. And I don't think I can emphasize that enough, that using our intellect, getting an education, is fundamental to who we are as a people. And the word that's often used in the Quran for intoxication is the word khamar. And khamar means to cover, to make hidden, right? You're covering your reason, you're veiling your reason. So the idea is that this is not something that you are supposed to do because you've been given this gift of reason. But the word kufr or disbelief means to cover something as well, so that we can understand this idea of khamar and kufr as being related, this idea of hiding something, hiding our reason, and therefore we also hide ourselves from God, or we hide God from ourselves. So how do we make sure that we're always pushing forward to deepen our relationship with God, to elevate ourselves, to elevate other people, and elevate our community? And I think this is really a fundamental part of this equation from a religion perspective, to really engage with, we have all these ethics, how do they fit together to invite us to a way that is better, right? So that it is always about love and support, that there are rules, but the rules come from love. And when we try to figure out how to respond to people who need help, when we try to figure out how to give people options, it should always be from a positionality of love. Because we so love God, we're doing these things. How do we get other people not to say bad or wrong, but to say, come and join us, come and do something that give people a better option. And I think finally is to also engage with possibilities without distraction. What happens when we lose these distractions that we've been talking about? What is possible for us when we can focus and do the long-term work? And that future, that possibility, that's what gives me hope. Knowing what I know about adolescence and the way adolescents respond to knowledge and information and serious, frank conversations, I think deeply about how what is possible for them moving into the future.
Yeah, and to pick up that thread, I think it's really important to think about how we talk to teens and youth specifically about drugs of abuse. And I think what's really important when talking to adolescents is that it's important to talk to them about their future, right? Because, you know, as I showed you, their brain is developing it a lot during this period in time. And a lot of that rational, good judgment part of their brain is in a state of flux. So really, they're very much living in the now. But I think what's important is to help them to understand that there is a later, there is a future that is coming. And I think the thing is that a lot of time when we have these conversations about our future with our children, it's like, oh, okay, fine, you're going to go to a good college and you're going to become a professional and it's going to be great. But that's not really so great in terms of imagining where you're really going to be in the future, right? That's just a lot of abstractions and possibilities. What you really want is to make a rich, full future life. And the way that you do that is you ask questions to your child about, you know, where do you see yourself living? Do you think you'd like to live in a big city, or do you think you'd like to live in the suburbs? You know, do you see yourself coaching Little League? Do you see yourself, what kind of friends do you think you're going to have? Do you think they're going to be like artists? Do you think they're going to be engineers? You know, how do you see yourself socializing and hanging out in the world? Do you want to travel? Like, do you want to see new places? Like, how do you envision yourself spending your free time when you're older? And I think the more conversations that you have with your children about this sort of filling out the rich picture of how they see themselves in the future, the more that they start to envision what they might have. And of course, those things can change. But the bottom line is that once that future idea is filled out and richer, it then makes it so that the decisions you're making in the present, you start to think, oh, well, wait a minute. If I do this, I might be putting myself in a situation where I can't have that job because maybe I'll have like a DUI or a drug record, or maybe I won't be able to travel to different countries because something is going to happen. And once you start to think about that future more carefully, once adolescents start to think about their future more fully, then they're more careful with the decisions that they make in the present. So now we can get into a little bit about, you know, indicators of drug use and distress. So first of all, if you think that someone in your family is using drugs, some of the things that you can observe is you can use your nose, first of all, right? So things like alcohol, smoking, vaping, marijuana, they all have a very distinct smell. And so if you start to smell those things, you can be fairly confident that somebody's using drugs in your house. The other thing to look out for are things like red, bloodshot eyes, dilated pupils, or flushed appearance, especially for marijuana use and to some extent alcohol use. Those are things that pop up. The other thing that people should keep an eye out for are things like sudden mood and behavior changes, unexpected weight changes, fatigue, secretive behavior, and abandonment of former friends and activities. Now, the thing is that this latter set of indicators, this is indication of distress, right? You could be depressed and any of these things could apply. You could be coming out of a pandemic as we're currently doing, and all of these things apply. This could be an example, bullying. If your child is being bullied, they might also experience all of these things. So don't panic if you see any of these things happening, but just note that this means that somebody is in distress. And so therefore, this is a perfect opportunity to open up that conversation and see what it is that might be the problem. And one thing I just want to make clear is that, if you do notice these indications of drug abuse, these first two symptoms, I just want you to remember that most people are not addicted. Most people are users. And so hopefully the person in your household that might be at this stage is not so far gone that they're in that cycle of addiction, and hopefully can be, can step back with some education and conversation. But it's just to say that, these are some of the things that you need to keep an eye out for, and these are some of the things to not freak out about. And the reason I say don't freak out about it is because that you should definitely not freak out if you think that your child or spouse or whoever may be using drugs, because that's the best way to pretty much shut down any future combination, is to start yelling and screaming or panicking, because nobody wants to talk to somebody who's in that kind of hectic state. It's very important to maintain open lines of communication and to just make sure that the other person knows that you love them, right? Or that you love them. Because the bottom line is a lot of times people just feel like, oh no, I did something, youth especially feel like, oh no, I've done something, my mom or dad is going to be so mad. And the first thing you need to do is reassure them that you love them, that you understand that they're doing this thing, and you'd like to have a conversation about it. And this is where it's important to express your desire to learn more and be curious. And this is where you have conversations as to like, well, why are you doing this? What do you get when you actually, what are you getting out of the experience? I think it's really important to describe some of the changes that you've noticed. A lot of times people don't even realize that these things are happening. They don't realize that they stopped hanging out with their friends, or that they're acting kind of dopey, or whatever the case might be, because they haven't had that moment of self-reflection. And if you actually point it out, that can actually be eye-opening for the individual to realize, oh, wait a minute, I didn't realize that these drugs were affecting me the way that they're affecting me. I also think that, in the same category as not freaking out, it's important to not over-exaggerate or be insincere. So you don't want to say things like, oh, you shouldn't be smoking pot because all of it is laced with fentanyl and you're going to die. Because the bottom line is that adolescents are very savvy, and they know that's not really going to happen. And when they hear those types of over-exaggerated or insincere statements, then they just start to shut it all down, because they're like, oh yeah, this conversation is not going to go anywhere. And it's also important to avoid forcing people to talk about these things, because the bottom line is that especially adolescents may not at all be interested in talking to their parents about their drugs of abuse. What can be helpful though is to like maybe reach out to an older sibling or an older cousin, a well-liked uncle or aunt, a friend or older, family member in the community that your child has a good relationship with, because then maybe they might open up to somebody else, and that will then allow them to talk about the issues that they might be facing. Now, if you do find that somebody has a major drug problem and they need support and help, the first thing that you should do is to consult a medical professional. This is where you can just start with your primary care physician, and they can lead you in the right direction as to how to get future support. I think it's also important to support the person that is going through this type of addiction. The bottom line is that seeking help for an addiction takes a lot of courage. And it's very important that that person feels secure, because if they don't feel secure, that's not going to help them like stop using drugs. And I think it's also really important to just remember that addiction is like a chronic illness. Think about what that heart looked like, the diseased heart and the healthy heart, and think about what the diseased brain and the healthy brain looked like. This is a chronic illness. And so the bottom line is that it's a chronic illness that does have treatment strategies available to it. And just like with all chronic illnesses, treatment can take a long time, but they can be very effective. You can switch that diseased brain back towards a healthy brain, but it just might take some time to do it, and we need to be patient. And just to give you an idea of what treatment looks like for addiction, well, usually it starts with some sort of therapy or some kind of a support group. And then depending on the drugs of abuse can also involve prescription drugs.
I want to pick up just on this note, or develop this idea, Amynah, that you had about supporting the other person. And I think about the fact that we say this phrase, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, every single day, multiple times a day. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. There's this idea that we talk about the attributes of God because we want to manifest those attributes in the world, that we talk about the attributes of God that we wish to manifest or see manifest in the world. And so what does it mean for us to say God is the most compassionate, the most merciful, and for us to manifest or try to manifest that in the world? And compassion is this idea of same feeling, of feeling with somebody else, that trying to understand where they're at and trying to work through them. And I think a lot of what you're talking about in terms of what to do, how to help somebody who is addicted, really pulls on that ethic of compassion, really builds on that community of compassion, and it invites us to generate that culture of compassion. And I think it's important that we also recognize that the root for the words Rahman and Rahim, Rama, means womb. It's the point where it is covering and encompassing and life generating. It's not about who's in and who's out. It's about culturing, and cultivating life. And so how do we do that as a community? And I think that's really what we're being invited to do whenever we call out Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And so how does that manifest when we start looking at people who are addicted, and we need to start being present for them as individuals who we may know, or as members of our community who need that sort of communal help? Do we know where the resources are? Do we know how to direct people? Can we be there for them? And sometimes it may be, I think you're right, a lot of what you're talking about is people who know somebody who is addicted very personally and perhaps relatively intimately, but you can also offer about rides, right? Making sure that people have access and ability to be able to get the treatments that they need. Just a simple thing like that, again, to facilitate that access is so important, or to translate. So really just thinking about the ways in which we can show up, have that compassion, be there for other people. Because for me, I think what we always need to do is have hope, give each other hope, because that allows us to then imagine that future, to engage with that future and say, what do I want it to look like? And how can I be part of that future? And I think that invites us to think about possibilities. And so Imam Zain al-Abidin in his prayer, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful, my God, who is the one who has come before you, my God, who is the one who has come before you seeking hospitality and whom you have not received hospitably. Should I cut off my hope for you when you have shown me your bounty of which I have not asked? How should I forget you when you never cease remembering me? How should I be diverted from you while you are my constant watcher? My God, I have fastened my hand to the skirt of your generosity. I have stretched forth my expectation toward reaching your gifts. Surrender me pure through the purest profession of your unity, and appoint me as one of your choice servants. O best object of hope, O most generous object of supplication, O one who never rejects an asker, and whose expectant is never disappointed. O one whose door is always open for his supplicants, and whose veil is lifted for those who hope in Allah. I ask you by your generosity to show kindness toward me through your gifts.
Well, thank you very much, Hussein. So I just wanted to end with to let everybody know that we do have a number of resources available for drugs of abuse that are available on the slide, and we're happy to share those resources if anybody is interested.
I want to thank our speakers for this incredible webinar.